Okay, railroads were the first big business, so we're going to concentrate on railroads for a while. With railroads, you have a double situation, so to speak. You have a double situation. It's true in general, but this is particularly true in railroads, which is the first large-scale industry. Namely, you have a fantastic progressive increase in standard of living, a fall in transportation costs and all that. And along with it, you have the government stepping in very heavily through subsidization, later regulation, and messing things up. So you have a double effect here. In other words, you have two things happening in a railroad situation. One is a tremendous competitive cheapening of costs, a competitive improvement in standard of living, an increase in competition. On the other hand, tremendous subsidies on the part of the government, plus later on attempts at merger and finally railroad regulation. And we'll see why railroad regulation came in later. As I mentioned before, the Lincoln administration was a heavily railroad-oriented administration, and one of the first things they were committed to was a huge subsidization program to the new transcontinental railroads, which they proposed to build across the West. The subsidization, first of all, in a homesteading system, which I already mentioned, was a libertarian proposal. What you have is the right of way is granted. In other words, if somebody wants to build a railroad across 1,000 miles of nothing, the property it would get in a homesteading law kind of setup would be whatever it uses. In other words, it's right of way. It would then own the right of way. So it means the tracks, the bed in which the track is embedded in stuff, and the station terminals and whatever. So essentially the shoulders, essentially a few feet in each side of the track. That would basically be what the railroad would own in a libertarian free market setup, a homesteading setup. And some railroads were indeed built that way. As a matter of fact, we'll see, one great transcontinental railroad was built in a purely free market thing, and it did not go bankrupt like almost all the others did. And it competed very well with the rest of it. It's called the Great Northern. That comes a little bit later. But at any rate, this is not the way it was done. What the Republicans wanted was a very heavy subsidization and privileging to the railroads. And so instead of just giving them the right of way, they gave the railroads, first of all, they gave them, as we'll see in more detail later as we go along, they gave them a huge amount of loans, basically interest-free loans, heavy subsidies per mile of track, and cash, plus huge amount of land, and 20 miles, every mile, alternate 20-mile sections, 20 square mile sections, which should mean something like 4.5 miles, whatever, about 4.5 miles in each, but an alternate section, so it means you can't do very much in here. In addition to that, the government, this is bad enough, and it's this huge subsidy here. Also, of course, this becomes the most, first of all, they gave the railroads the best land in the West. Second of all, in addition to giving them all this land, the U.S. government closed for settlement all land on each side up to about 60, sometimes 100 miles. Closed off. Nobody was allowed to settle. To 100 miles on either side of the track. So in other words, obviously everybody wants to get to the railroad station because that's there's not much going on the West here except the railroad, and the rest is Indian country or whatever, barren. So this becomes the choicest land. The government closed off for settlement, didn't allow anybody to settle any place except buying land from the railroads. In other words, railroads get this free land from the government and then resell it to the settlers at a high price, essentially a monopoly price, so to speak. Especially because the government kept out of settlement for many years everything on each side for many miles, 80 miles or so on each side of the railroad. Fantastic subsidization. And because of this, an enormous amount of cookery also took place. In addition to this boodle, what was often called the robber barons came in. The robber barons were really, the robbery came about because it was an open channel by the federal government. And we'll see how that was done. The amount of there's differences of whichever place you go to get the data, how many millions of miles of acreage was handed out by the federal government to the railroads. I guess it depends on which, some of it was given back, and some. It was around 220 million acres, an enormous amount. Especially considering, as I say, no, the other land wasn't worth much, and a huge amount, much more than that, was kept out of circulation for many years, forcing people, if they want to get on this thing, to settle to buy land at a high price from the railroad. As a result of this and other things, and we'll see as we go along, the farmers begin to start griping about the railroads. And the thing is, the later gripes are much more irrational. Later gripes are the freight rates were too high, which they obviously weren't, and they were falling all the time. But the basic gripes came about by the 1870s, by the late 1860s and early 1870s, was so-called anti-monopoly movement among the Western farmers. Well, they had very good grievances. They had all this land was being kept out of circulation. Railroad had this free gift of land, and all this land was held out of circulation, and this land was untaxed by the local government. So he had set up a local government. The railroad land was tax exempt, even while being held out of circulation. So naturally, I don't blame the farmers for griping. I'd be griping too. So it wasn't a socialistic or statist type of gripe, the anti-monopoly movement. It was really essentially an attack on the railroad privileges. Basically, there were 4 big transcontinental railroads which got the big bulk of the subsidies and the grants and the loans. If we get it's really 3 if you look at it. One of them was in 2 halves. I'm not exactly a distinguished cartographer, but I'll do my best here. All right, something like that. Anyway, the two big grants at the beginning. The first big grant was the Union Pacific, which started, I believe, in Omaha, Nebraska, and went west, and then the Central Pacific, which started from San Francisco, and went east to join it. Now, this is the UPCP. This is the famous Golden Spike. I think it was 1869. They met in Utah, and they drove the golden spike, symbolized whatever. So this is very heavily subsidized, the Union Pacific, Central Pacific. We'll see. Then there's the Northern Pacific, which begins around, west of Chicago, I think, east of Iowa, around there, and it goes to Portland. Another very heavily subsidized. This got about 44 million acres plus a lot of money subsidy. 44 million acres. All of these, I think, went bankrupt not too long. In other words, the big land grant boom was Union Pacific got its first big grant in 1862. The others a few years later, and the whole thing collapsed by 1872. So it was actually in the panic of 1873, most of them went bankrupt. So it was about 10 years of fantastic boom. And so the separate, well, let's see, there's yeah. I should have looked at the map. Somewhere near Chicago. It was somewhere west of Chicago. Yeah.
What is the use of keeping it alternate land out of the reach of people?
Well, the use is to give the railroads a fantastic increase in price. In other words, if you'd like to settle somewhere here, you can't do it because it's kept out of use by the government. The government, remember, owns all the land automatically, okay? It means you have to go to the railroad land and buy it for a very high price. This benefits the railroads, an extra privilege to the railroads. The railroads are getting subsidies about 3 ways. They're getting a big land grant, then getting land taken out of circulation. So the settlers have to settle on railroad land, buy the land at a high price in railroads, instead of going here for nothing, really, you see. And so it's part of the monopoly situation. Plus they got a huge amount of loans per mile of track, financial, outright cash loans or grants or how to. So these are the two big transcontinental ones. And then there was Southern Pacific, which starts in Los Angeles and continues somewhere in Texas. That wasn't, sort of transcontinental, I guess. Okay, so this is Northern Pacific got the most amount of land. It got 44 million acres. And I think the other three got 44 million. Of course, this is about half each, all these three together got about 44 million. So about 88 million just of those, the big four, so to speak. I shouldn't call them the big four. The big four is also named the Central Pacific leadership. At any rate, those big four transcontinental railroads. This is originally Central Pacific. Very soon, Central Pacific merges with Southern Pacific and basically takes it over under the name Southern Pacific. I mean, these guys are running it. This becomes Southern Pacific, the whole California thing, a little bit later. The Union Pacific, one interesting phenomenon here, which I only found out about a couple of years ago. I was reading more about this. Here we get this. Well, anyway, Grenville Dodge was the main entrepreneur of Union Pacific, and as soon as the Civil War starts, he gets himself appointed a general in the American Army, the Northern Army, of course. And he takes a whole bunch of troops, federal troops, takes it out of the war, and uses the troops to do what? Because they knew what the route was going to be, of course. All the insiders knew. Well, by the way, another thing they did is the insiders, the top entrepreneurs and president, vice president, etc., knew what the route would be. They often bought land along the way and then sold it to the railroad at a very high price. All right. Anyway, the General Dodge takes a whole bunch of soldiers and uses a huge army and uses it to destroy all the Indians en route. It was just genocidal massacre of the Indians in order to clear the route for his own goddamn railroad, which should be granted to him in 1862. That was his army function. I think it's an interesting example of the use of the army as what does it mean? It means, you see, one of the things you have to realize about business and government, the use of government by businessmen to socialize costs. In other words, to take their costs and impose them, because nobody wants to pay out costs. To take the costs and impose them on the taxpayer, whatever it amounts to. So use the army. What the hell? You take the army, they are conscripts anyway. Use them to kill all the Indians en route, so as to clear the path for Union Pacific. Then as soon as he clears the path, he gets out of the army and becomes the head of Union Pacific, isn't he? Another thing these guys did, I'll give you some examples as we go along. Everybody was on the take. I mean, all the congressmen were on the take. There was a Union Pacific group in Congress, headed, I think it was Union Pacific. Let me just make sure it's Union Pacific group was headed by Congressman Oakes Ames of Massachusetts, and he was the leader of what was known as the Union Pacific faction. And what they did is everybody was on the take. When Grant comes in 1864, 1860, I guess 68. When Grant comes in 68, his entire administration was on the take. His personal secretary, his vice president, the head of the Senate, the head of the House, the whole gang was on the take. I mean, literally on the take for both Union Pacific and Northern Pacific. Grant himself was not on the take. Grant himself was drunk most of the time and didn't know what was going on. I mean, you could say he was honest, but I don't think he cared one way or the other. Everybody else was on the take, and the whole gang was involved with this thing. And what they would get is this: not only would they get actual money and cash from the railroads, in three cases, the Central Pacific, Union Pacific, and Northern Pacific, the top managers would form construction companies. Their own construction. In other words, the railroads were a big business. They had a huge amount of stockholders and a huge amount of bondholders. It was a big corporate, it's the only really big corporation. Most of the banks invested about 10% of the stock. The rest of it was private investors. Many of them were English. Also, a lot of small investors because it was on the stock market. There was no stocks, no manufacturing companies were on the stock market yet. They were all private partnerships. They weren't big enough to have corporations. But railroads are big enough now to be incorporated. So you had a huge number of stockholders. The inside managers not only had a lot of stock, but they also they formed their own construction companies. One of them, I think, the Central Pacific. It's called the Credit Mobilier. I'll get to that specifics in a minute. They formed these construction companies, which are formed by the only stockholders of these construction companies were the top stockholders of the railroads. They went into the construction business. They built the railroads and sold the railroads then to the railroads. In other words, the Central Pacific, the Union Pacific Construction Company, constructed the railroad with huge grants of money, subsidies from the government, being per mile of many cases of track. And then they sell it to the railroad. They sell it at a very high price. The estimates are about the price is about double what they would have been charged in the free market. In other words, double the cost, basic price in the free market. So it's essentially these guys fleece their own stockholders and bondholders, essentially robbing with government, based on government subsidies too. Yeah.
The owners of the railroad and the construction company.
Yeah, not all the owners, the top owners, the few insiders.
This over their railroad.
Yeah.
How were they making money? Wasn't the railroad losing money then?
Yes, exactly. The situation is, let's say you want to form a big corporation. Okay, you're a 2% shareholder, you and two other buddies. Then you form another corporation, you're the president. You then hire another corporation headed by yourself and buddy, and your buddies, which have 100% of the share, to sell all the equipment. You sell at a very high price, and essentially you're fleecing your other shareholders. What amounts to is robbery of the other shareholders by the few insiders. It was, of course, illegal then, but there was no prosecution because the government was in on this stuff. So as a result, you have very low profit rates of the railroad and eventual bankruptcies. Much of this huge amount of profits by the construction companies. They were coining it. Their capital was given to them by the taxpayer in most cases, and then they'd sell it at double the value to their own railroad. Well, that was part of it, sure. I mean, the fact it was overbuilt, heavy subsidies. Yeah, that was part of the cause. Was this? Hard to say mismanagement. They didn't care about management. They just wanted to milk the whole situation. I'll give you some examples of all this. I'll just give you an overall picture. Yeah, Union Pacific was a Credit Mobilier scandal. Let's see. I'll give you some examples here. For example, both for Union Pacific and Central Pacific, they got special federal government loans, 30-year bonds. They were paid by Union Pacific case was the Central Credit Mobilier. Central Pacific, it was the Credit Finance Corporation, it was called. Okay. Credit Mobilier and the Credit Finance Corporation. And so to say and this financed the railroad construction. And what happened, by the way, is the congressmen, what they got was not just cash. The congressmen, the senators, and the vice president, all that, they got shares, free shares, not on the railroad, but on the construction company. That was in other words, they got the senators and the congressmen, and the vice presidents, they got free, 1,000 free shares of Credit Mobilier. How will the railroad? The railroad is not going to take it in the chin and all this. Notice it was a robber baron era, but it was a robbery only really facilitated and permitted by the fact that there were these huge government subsidies. The whole thing was tied in together. For example, the Credit and Finance Corporation, which was the Central Pacific's construction company, they sold the constructed railroad for $79 million to the Central Pacific. It was really only worth The free market was worth, say, 36 million. So it was more than double. The 79 million one was owned, there were top 4 people who ran this, who were the main owners of Central Pacific. They were the sole owners of the construction company, whereas the actual Central Pacific had a lot of course, shareholders and bondholders. So that was the way it was done. In the case of Union Pacific, the Credit Mobilier, the costs were, the normal cost, the normal value was 44 million, and they sold it to the Union Pacific for 94 million. Again, more than double. Slightly more than double. Again, there was the top people owned it, plus, of course, the congressmen and senators. Get there, that little... So, now, by the way, Oaks Ames, I should mention about Oaks Ames, the Union Pacific cheerleader in the... What was his shtick, in addition to being on the take? He had a special interest in Union Pacific. He was a shovel manufacturer in real life. This is what I meant first time I talked about. It's important to know what these guys do in the real world, in addition to being congressmen. He manufactured shovels. Who do you think got the shovel contract for the construction company to build Union Pacific? One guess. Okay. It was Oaks Ames. He's selling shovels, again, at a handsome price to Union Pacific, for which he got the contract. So so the Union Pacific had on the take, all right, distributing stock of the Credit Mobilier, okay, the construction company. The vice president-elect, the Democratic House leader, Speaker of the House James Blaine, who was called he ran for president one year, was called the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. James Garfield, senator from Ohio, was later to be president. Another very interesting character we'll deal with a little bit later called Pig Iron Kelly. He was a congressman from Pittsburgh area, William D. Kelly. He was known as Pig Iron because he was blatantly and obviously the representative in Congress of the pig iron interests. Of course, iron and steel were the big companies in the Pittsburgh area, always calling for tariffs and all sorts of other subsidies for pig iron. Well, the way Ames put it, I like the way he put it, by the way, Oaks Ames, and he's explaining why he gave a lot of free shares of top Credit Mobilier stock to congressmen. He said, quote, "We want more friends in this Congress. There's no difficulty in getting them to look after their own property." I like that. That's kind of an interesting way of putting it. Of course, taxpayer suffering from this, and of course the other railroad men. The Northern Pacific, first of all, I should talk about the Central Pacific. Central Pacific is interesting, another interesting group. It was run, Union Pacific, let's say, was Oaks Ames and the Grenville Dodge. The Central Pacific, which hooked up with it from San Francisco, was run by the so-called Big Four, which had the sole owners of the construction corporation. Okay. Interesting characters. The families of the Big Four, the 4 people, are still dominant in California even to this day, which is pretty amazing. The big quartet was Charles Crocker, who was the contractor. All over California, there's still the Crocker Bank everywhere. Same family. Collis Huntington, who was sort of a dominant guy. Huntington. The major. He also dealt with Washington a lot. Okay. Mark Hopkins is again another big figure in California. His famous Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco, which is the top of the Mark, the famous landmark in San Francisco, looking over the bay and all that. He was a real managerial type. He took care of the actual running of the railroad. And Leland Stanford, another, of course, key figure, founder of Stanford University, and he went into state politics. He was the governor. He became governor of California, made sure that the Central Pacific, is taken care of, to put it mildly. When Stanford ran for governor, the story is, and I think there's no reason to doubt it, Phil Stanford, his brother, stood outside the polling place in San Francisco scattering gold coins for the masses. They went up to vote. Right now, apparently the vote, somebody was telling me what the vote in the Philippines is. Current election, the running figure is $50 a vote, which is enormous. Of course, that's about a monthly wage. Weekly wage or monthly wage? Philippine. Anyway, monthly, yeah. Big. So, several hundred, equivalent of about, what is it, $500 here or something? Something like that. More than that. Anyway, so, scattering gold coins, which meant a lot then, and, of course you can say, since there was a secret ballot, there was, no way of checking. On the other hand, you got a lot of coinage, some gold coins in your pocket, you feel Mr. Stanford is worth your vote. At any rate, the sort of stuff they did was that for example, the idea, they were going along the Sierras, and what happens in California is you're zipping along pretty nicely until suddenly you reach the high Sierras, big mountains there. How do you get around them? Well, they had a 40 miles north of this route, there was a 1% grade. In other words, across the mountain. Right here there's a 2% grade, which was much costlier, of course, much more difficult. And they figured in a free market railroad, they would have gone 40 miles, would have saved a lot of money by taking the 1% grade. Here they said, the hell with it, we're getting paid per mile by the government, and we wanted money fast. You see, if you keep laying track a certain number of miles, you get the money. They wanted the money. And so they didn't care because their costs were recouped by the government. In other words, like a cost plus such operation. Who cares about the cost? They want the money fast. Uncle Sam is going to pay for the cost. Let's do it. So as a result, you have situations like that. Another thing they did is at one point they came to the route of the Sacramento Valley Railroad, somewhere around here. It would have been simple to just buy the road, the short railroad. Instead of that, they built another road right alongside it. What's the point? It was costlier. They didn't care. They wouldn't get subsidized, you see, if they bought the other railroad. The subsidy is per mile of track. The construction company gets a subsidy. They don't get subsidized by the government for buying something. So they say, what the hell? So you see how the market efficiencies are being skewed by governmental incentives, where the incentive is not to be efficient, not to make profits or avoid losses. The incentive is to get the money from the government. And whatever conditions are laid down, that's what you do. As one guy put it, quote, it was cheaper to build at the government expense than to buy a railroad already existing. In other words, at your own expense. So let that be a lesson. An analysis of contemporary, past, or whatever economic history. The estimated waste in this thing was about 75%. In other words, the estimates are the cost of the track and laying it and so forth is about 75% higher than it should have been if they'd really done this on free market incentives. If the government weren't paying for it. As far as the Central Pacific goes also, there's a great story here. In order to get this contract, in order to get this money from the government, Collis P. Huntington goes to Washington, takes a train or whatever. I don't know how he gets there. Anyway, gets to Washington. He takes a bag with him of $200,000 in cash. You have to realize $200,000 in those days was enormous. I mean, it's the equivalent, I don't know what equivalent is now, but maybe 20 million or something. Okay? And, well, nobody knows how he spent it. All they know is after lobbying and seeing big shots in Washington, he left with the bag empty. Okay? And he wasn't a gambling type. And so that's it. So he disposed of $200,000 of hard cash to politicians to get this deal. Anyway, later on, as I say, they bought Southern Pacific. They changed the name to Southern Pacific. And Southern Pacific, which was then the combined, I guess they connected up, really ran California politics for a long, long time. Decades, virtually. California was essentially in many ways a Southern Pacific state. Okay, as far as Northern Pacific goes, that had several entrepreneurs, and finally gets into the hands by 1869 of the fabulous J. Cooke. Now, we've already talked about J. Cooke as making millions out of the Civil War through his bond deals, being the monopoly underwriter of government bonds, which he still was now after the war was over, and also by setting up a bank and a national banking system which requires pyramiding credit on top of government bonds, so the banks have to buy bonds from Cooke Anyways, he's in great shape. Anyway, he gets control of Northern Pacific by 1869, and he starts running that. Jay Cooke, by the way, was known as a tycoon in those days. I think the first guy in which the word tycoon was applied to. Everybody had an epithet, sort of the way that people worked in that period. That was his epithet. He was the tycoon. What he did was he started selling, because he had his own construction company and stuff, he started to sell bonds to push Northern Pacific, also to try to get people to settle there. This area is bad enough to schlep up here, and this whole northern area, it's cold and it's miserable and all that. He's trying to get people to settle in this rotten area. So he hires a whole bunch of propagandists. He used the same techniques that he used when he was selling government bonds. Hire a whole bunch of pamphleteers to write about how wonderful it is, and distribute it in Europe and whatever. He had, for example, a guy named Sam Wilkerson who wrote a bunch of pamphlets, hopped up pamphlets about the glories of this area. And he said, I think one of the phrases was that the climate is like Paris in April. This is the climate of Wyoming and North Dakota and all that. Tell them anything. Tell the suckers anything. Get them up there. You see why the farmers are all irritated, and they finally schlep up there and they find it's a little bit different. A little bit different situation. So Northern Pacific had on the take. They had big shot stockholders who were granted stock freely. Construction company, Vice President Schuyler Colfax, Rutherford Hayes, who was later President, Secretary of the Treasury. And of course they had Chief Justice Salmon Chase. Oh, by the way, before I get to him, they also had Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. He was probably the most distinguished minister in the United States, a New York Protestant minister. Actually, he came from Brooklyn. And he was on the take. He was paid by Northern Pacific to talk about the glories of the Northwest and all that. Be sure to schlep out the Northwest and settle there and things like that. Write pamphlets. They had propaganda meetings for the area and things like that. Chief Justice, who's now Chief Justice of the United States, Salmon P. Chase. And not only is he still on the take from Northern Pacific, but he wants Jay Cooke. He comes to Cooke and he urges Cooke. Remember, Cooke has financed Chase's whole career, virtually. He comes to Cooke privately and says, make me a secret partner of Cooke Company, which is a big investment bank. It's not supposed to be done. If you're a Supreme Court justice, it's supposed to be a little bit above the back. You're not supposed to be a secret partner of some damn investment bank, which is running half the country anyway. So Cooke says, Cooke says, no, it's too risky. But he's a very greedy guy, Chase, let's face it. His appetite was enormous. But he was also a secret stockholder of Northern Pacific. And in addition to that, Chief Justice Chase, the private secretary of President Grant was on the team. He was also a secret stockholder of Northern Pacific, General Horace Porter. Speaker Blaine was giving some trouble. I told you about Blaine, this continental liar in the state of Maine. He was on the payroll of the Southern Pacific. He was on the take. So he was giving the Northern Pacific some trouble in getting their stuff. So finally, Jay Cooke's brother Henry, was a journalist and a big-time, full-time aide, a long-time aide of Chief Justice Chase at this point. And a friend of President Grant goes to Grant and he convinces Grant. Grant is very much in favor of Northern Pacific. And so he gets Grant to be in favor of Northern Pacific. And then what Jay Cooke does, he gives, in order to buy the favor of Speaker Blaine, he gives him a very big long-term loan. Long-term loan, low interest. Now, a quote, loan, unquote. So that takes care of Blaine's stubborn opposition, Southern Pacific Board opposition. They say in politics, by the way, a friend of mine one of the big things, by the way, in politics now, and crooked politics now, and local politics, is the cable stuff. Of course, the Brooklyn, I think Brooklyn still hasn't got cable. It's outrageous. What happens is, the reason why many cities still don't have cable is that they're fighting over who gets the local monopoly franchise. Instead of permitting free competition, each one is fighting for the monopoly. Now, my friend who lives in Tucson, Arizona, is a big observer of local politics, So they finally, cable was going to come to Tucson. There were two cable companies were fighting for the monopoly franchise. Okay, a very lucrative monopoly. So a couple of city councilmen going to take a vote. A couple of city councilmen asked and pleaded for a secret secret ballot, so which company should get it. And they said, this is outrageous, secret ballot. The reason why they wanted a secret ballot, they were on the take from both companies. So they didn't want to be found out by either one. And so they were very embarrassed when the vote was public. And they had a vote one way or the other. So, which is one of the definitions of honest politician. I think this is George Washington Plunkett, the famous old Tammany leader. Definition of an honest politician is one who stays bought. So if you make your contract the briber, you stick to it. If you don't stay bought, then then in politics you're usually in big trouble. Okay, so now J. Cooke and Company, here's J. Cooke owning the Northern Pacific and all that as a major leader. J. Cooke and Company gets, of course, from the Northern Pacific the fiscal agency. In other words, it gets the power, the sole power to underwrite bonds and stocks issued by Northern Pacific. It charges they charge a 12% commission, which is about double the usual commission. So here's the one example where Cooke fleeces the fellow stockholders. You're an investment banker for your own railroad, except you own most of your bank, but you only own a small portion of the railroad. If you can fleece the bank, you're shifting funds quietly but illegally from your fellow stockholders, your comrades, stockholders and bondholders, to yourself and a couple of other guys in the bank. So anyway, so Cooke put on, as I said, a big propaganda campaign. First of all, to buy Northern Pacific bonds. Second of all, to settle in north and northwest of the United States. And he had traveling agents and so forth and so on. One of the traveling agents whom he brought over for this thing later becomes president of Northern Pacific. Was a German, fairly wealthy German named Henry Villard that comes over and later becomes, I say, president. Anyway, J. Cooke and Company, and it doesn't always happen. In fact, it very rarely happens in history where justice triumphs. It's pretty rare. In the case of J. Cooke, however, justice triumphed, and I'm happy to record that. To show that life can be beautiful sometimes. Here's J. Cooke, the monopoly underwriter, multi-millionaire, the tycoon, owner of Northern Pacific, creator of the national banking system, the top investment banker, and so forth and so on. He's, of course, his headquarters in Philadelphia. J. Cooke goes bluey. He does it because Northern Pacific is now beginning to collapse. And he's getting loans out. It's overextended. All these railroads are very inefficient, you have to realize. They will run badly because nobody cared about how they were run. They just want to fleece it as much as possible. From an engineering point of view, they're all in terrible shape. From an entrepreneurial point of view, they're in terrible shape. So here's Cooke trying to get loans, and bingo comes the Panic of 1873. And much of which was brought about by Cooke's own inflationary manipulations through the banks and the government bonds, etc. Cooke goes bankrupt. It's one of the great pieces of poetic justice ever. Going bankrupt at your own creation, more or less. In other words, here he is. He's responsible for Northern Pacific's overextension. He's responsible for the inflationary boom of the late 60s and the early 70s. He's responsible for the big public debt, which comes in, and the whole bank credit expansion. And when the collapse comes, as it always does come, he gets it in the neck. It was the end of J. Cooke. The fall of the House of Cooke, as it was called. And he sets up these lying pamphlets about how great the climate is in the Northwest. All the rest of it, he finally gets it. What happens is he gets it and who replaces? Well, what happens is he's of course the Republican, very wrapped up with the Republican Party, very wrapped up with Chase, with Salmon P. Chase, with the Lincoln administration and the Grant administration, and when he falls, he's toppled. His place is now taken in investment banking by another Philadelphia firm called Drexel Morgan and Company. And this is the beginning of the famous rise of J.P. Morgan, fame and fortune. Anthony Drexel was a famous Philadelphia banking, financial and banking industry family, a Drexel-Biddle family, which is still around. The Biddles are still functioning. Yeah, the same stuff, right. Morgan was the son of a British banker, and Junius Morgan was younger than Drexel, and very soon took over. He was obviously a dominant force, and finally winds up as J.P. Morgan and Company. But anyway, this is the result of this is the rise of J.P. Morgan, who becomes a dominant figure in American politics, also, as we'll see later, and from 1873 on. In other words, it was the panic of 1873 and the collapse of Cooke that allows room for some new faces, so to speak, in the situation. Morgan is essentially a Democrat, was involved in the Democratic Party, although he became also prominent in the New England wing of the Republican Party, as we'll see later on. Okay, so all these, Villard, after Cooke goes bankrupt, Villard becomes head of Northern Pacific and tries to run it, and doesn't do very well. It's finally, again, the costs are excessive and so forth. By this time, by 1873, with 1872, 1873, is the end of the railroad land grants. I mean, that's it. With the end of the grant administration, with the panic, the massive land grants are over. So now Northern Pacific has to sort of make it on its own, and couldn't do it. And it goes bankrupt around the late 70s. And, it goes into bankruptcy. Of course, the bankruptcy in the case of railroad doesn't mean the whole track is destroyed. It means the whole reorganization and whatever. Coming in, the last transcontinental railroad to make it, doing it purely almost without any government subsidy at all. Certainly with no grants, no loans, or all the rest of it. Really heroic action. This was the so-called Great Northern, which started up in Duluth, Minnesota, way up in northern Minnesota, and skirted the Canadian border. Sometimes on the American side, sometimes the Canadian side, something like that. And comes into Seattle. And notice all these, even though there are only a few transcontinental railroads, they all compete with each other. If you're going to send shipments out to the West Coast or over to the East, you can take any one of these routes. And so they're all really in competition. So, of course, this is called the Great Northern. The Great Northern is completed around 1870s, I believe, and it was, of course, mostly in competition with Northern Pacific. And this was organized by an entrepreneur was James J. Hill, the last of the great railroad magnates. Hill is a very interesting character. He's one of these people who fit the complete Horatio Alger picture, which is the so-called stereotype, Horatio Alger stereotype. He was born in Canada, poor. He was born in a log cabin. He was actually born in a log cabin, which is not something, even though it sounds great, it's not something to really hope that you're born in. He came from a Scotch-Irish farm in Ontario. He became a clerk. He was uneducated. Most of these people were uneducated. He becomes a clerk, comes to the age of 18, emigrates to St. Paul, Minnesota, and he starts getting interested he starts buying out small bankrupt railroads and starts integrating them and making them more efficient. He's an extremely efficient construction person. And he was also, he started, his first railroad was called the St. Paul, Minnesota, Manitoba Railroad, a small railroad. What he went for, I think he was also short and thin. A lot of these guys are quite short, otherwise, these big entrepreneurs then. Rockefeller was very short. I mention that because there are not too many short entrepreneurs these days. They were short. At any rate, he specializes in low rates, cheap freight rates. Of course, freight is the big thing. The passengers are, from an economic point of view, didn't mean much for these companies, and a large volume and being competitive. And so he's very efficient. It's a very efficient railroad. It's always outcompeted North Pacific. It made good profits. It was there was no phony construction company. The whole thing was on the up and up. It was kind of a heroic thing, the James J. Hill, and so it's a good counter image. And and by the way, when he encouraged immigration, but he was there. He knew the area. He raised wheat in this area in Manitoba. He knew exactly, what the climate was like. So he didn't have to lie to the public because he was actually there. None of these guys, these pamphleteers, are somewhere sitting in Philadelphia. They didn't know what's going on in the Northwest. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back with. Let's turn the stuff off. Okay, the anti-monopoly movement, at least the late 60s and early 70s, focused on these problems with land grants and the land, and called for the later movement. 1880s, we're talking about railroad rates, which were not really a problem. But this one zeroed in on things like demanding no future land grants, which the railroads, which they accomplished in 1873, demanding forfeiture of the unused land grants. Now, a lot of these land grants were simply there, unused yet, waiting for a price to get higher, demanding that they be forfeited, and demanding also a taxation of the railroad lands and a forced sale of them. Those weren't really accomplished so much, but at least they ended the new land grants. Another large racket that occurred in this whole period was what happened to Indian lands. See, lands were supposed to be homesteaded, except the maximum size, as I said, was 160 acres. But any lands that the Indians got kicked out of was sort of up for grabs. There's no homesteading applied to it. There's a lot of finagling going on with taking them and selling them to huge blocks to speculators or to railroads. So railroads got a lot of extra land that way. One of the famous examples of that was the Cherokee tract in southeastern Kansas, which is like a whole quarter here or something, almost, in southeastern Kansas. The Cherokees were kicked out. The land then gets opened up. What's going to happen to it? And it was sold by the federal government in 1868 to a guy named James F. Joy, who was also known as the Railroad King, at least in Iowa, Illinois, Iowa, and now Kansas. And James Joy was the head of the Kansas City Fort Scott and Gulf Railroad. It was sold to him for, by the way, there were settlers there. I should mention this. A whole bunch of settlers on this land. They were disregarded. The whole thing was sold to Joy, and this is a little bit like the South American or Asian case where people are living there and they're farming the land, and all of a sudden this guy's now the owner. And it sold to him very cheaply, and he takes, I think it was sold to him for $1 an acre, and then he resells it for about $2 an acre to settlers, so he's getting a big profit on no investment, or almost no investment. The reason why he got this big deal, Senator James Joy, is the land was sold to him by the Secretary of the Interior. Secretary of the Interior, of course, is in charge of the public domain. It still is. So it's a powerful position. In those days, of course, it meant running the whole West. And Secretary of the Interior then allows this deal to take place with Jim Joy. Who was the Secretary of the Interior? And we know the name of the Secretary of the Interior, Orville Browning of Illinois, all right? But most historians stop there. Many historians just say, well, all right, Secretary Browning. But it also so happens that Browning was the brother-in-law of Jim Joy. All right? Now the light becomes even clearer as to why this occurred. Browning had represented, before he became Secretary of the Interior, and after he left the Secretary of the Interiorship, he represented Joy as his lawyer. So we have a very close relationship between Jim Joy and the Railroad King, as he was called, and Browning, Railroad King. Another similar situation happened to another part of Kansas, the Osage tribe lands. That was a lot. It was about 8 million acres. Before continuing with railroads, I just want to talk a little bit about the land situation, land question. The Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a famous thesis around 1900 or so called the Turner thesis about the importance of the frontier in American history, the land question of the frontier, the fact that there's always a frontier out there. And there's been a lot of arguments back and forth about it. Basically, it has a great deal of sense to it. One fact is that the frontier provided what's called a safety valve. In other words, people didn't like it in the east. They nipped out west to find fame and fortune and all that sort of thing. And so what you have is an enormous expanse of free land, or more or less free land once you get there and so forth. I mean, there's differences on that. Lots of land available, and this is extremely important in American history. It distinguishes America from, say, Europe and most other areas, namely the enormous amount of land and enormous ratio of land to labor. So so if you have a huge amount of land per labor, then you have all sorts of different economic, sociological, whatever, in production. For example, the kind of agriculture we have in the United States is very different from, say, in Europe. Because you don't try to, at least until recently, certainly during the 19th century, you don't try to economize on land. There's lots of land. There's land coming out the yang-yang, as my mother-in-law used to say. Lots of land. There's not enough people to till it. So in other words, people become very expensive. Labor is scarcer. And land is very abundant. So the kind of farming methods are those which are determined by that kind of situation. In other words, you economize on labor and not on land. You use lots of land because land is not very scarce. So the land-labor ratio is very high. On the other hand, in Europe, if you've ever been to Western Europe, for example, everything is tilled. It's intensive agriculture. There's very little land per person. Lots of people and very little land. So the land-labor ratio is very low in Europe. As a result, so European agriculture is known as intensive. In other words, there's very careful cultivation of every square foot practically is cultivated. Matter of fact, it's very charming. If you go to the Alps, you're up on the highest regions of the Alps almost, and there's up there, and there's lots of cows, and there's cows with bells on them, and their neck, and things like that. Cabins and things going on. There's lots of people, and lots of tilling, and I find it very charming. You go to the Rockies or whatever, of course, there's nobody there. No people, no nothing, no cultivation. So what you have is extensive cultivation in the United States. In other words, lots of land, and therefore there's no intensive methods. So European agriculturalists would come to the United States and say that terrible the technology here, the agriculture is very backward. But it wasn't that it was backward. It's not as if Americans didn't know about intensive agriculture. This was not economically unnecessary to have intensive agriculture. You don't have to worry about land. What you worry about is labor. So that this determines very different kinds of methods, technological methods in agriculture. It would have been ridiculous to have intensive agriculture in the United States when there's plenty of land around. There's very few people and plenty of land. You have a very different kind of agriculture. Okay? Or extensive agriculture. You don't try to farm every square foot, things like that. So it all depends what you've got, what your resources you've got, and the response is accordingly. I don't know, by the way, and there's still a lot of argument. I know very little about Indian agriculture. There's still a lot of argument about Indian agriculture. There's one set of economists who claim that Indian agriculture is uneconomic because of the cow is sacred and therefore cows are never killed. On the other hand, there's another contending group which claims that cows have an important agricultural function. It's not economically weak or whatever. So I don't want to get into this argument because I know very little about it. There's a contending, it's not obvious. Okay, let's put it that way. So another thing is that of course, it becomes a little more intensive now, but even in this situation, even later on, you still have a much more extensive agriculture in the United States. Also, the kinds of sociologically different. In other words, usually European farmers are in villages. They're all located in villages. This is sort of as a model. They all live together. In other words, you have a village with lots of people in it. It's a farming village, and the farms are out here somewhere. either right behind your house or a couple of miles out. Everybody's got their plot. Okay, so and of course there are commons and everything. I'm talking about even with individual plots. So everybody's sort of together here in the village, and they go out in the daytime and farm and come back. In the United States, we have lots of land and very few people. The settlement patterns are very different. Everybody's, as you know, they have an isolated farm. You got the family farm is out here, and you got lots of land out there, and there's another farm way the hell out here. So it's much more lonely existence, or individualistic existence, sociologically, than in Europe. Villages are just trading villages. You have a few people and, supermarkets or whatever, general stores. But every individual is physically, spatially, wide apart. Whereas in Europe, they're clustered together in the village, farming villages. I suppose you can say it makes more individualistic. American farmers be more individualistic. I suppose that's true. So Turner talked about the individualism of the farmer, the frontier. Talked about it being more democratic. I'm not so sure about that, but it's at least an aspect of it. Another aspect he did not talk about because it was so ingrained in him he didn't even think about it much, although it's in there if you look at it. Namely, most of these people were Yankees, as I pointed out, and they're all pietists, in addition to being individualistic. Most of them had come from New England, rural New England. They all wanted to outlaw liquor and crush Catholics and things like that, including Turner. Like him, it was so ingrained as himself a lost pietist that he didn't think twice about it. So I think it is important. Also, it was a safety valve. People could get out if there's a depression or recession in New York or Philadelphia. All right, the heck with it. You find a farm somewhere. And a lot of that was being done. In contrast to that, a lot of people didn't like the fact that people couldn't have a safety valve. So a lot of eastern landowners, let's say you're a fairly large landowner in Massachusetts or in the South. You don't want workers or farm workers, say, leaving and schlepping to Wisconsin and set up a farm. You want them working here so you can have a cheap labor supply. And so this always happens, a constant, in the Industrial Revolution in England, for example. The main opponents of the Industrial Revolution were the landlords. They didn't want their farm workers leaving the farm and going off to a factory somewhere. It means they haven't got the farm workers. It means they have to pay more for higher wages. And so they're constantly trying to cripple the development of industry in England. The first statist legislation, quote, socialistic legislation, unquote, were put in essentially by Tory landlords who wanted to keep the farm workers on a farm, damn it. They didn't want to have have factories available to them so they could move. There's a similar sort of process here by Easterners and Southerners particularly, wanted to limit land development in the West, keep out homesteaders, keep out settlements. They have to stay here and work. Again, remember, labor was particularly scarce in the United States. I might have mentioned this before, but in the South, slavery in the South, was probably essential to large-scale plantation ownership development, and they felt that if they weren't here on the plantation, they'd leave somewhere, which they undoubtedly would have. At any rate, but as I say, with the 1862, the Homesteading Act in 1862, you have a breakthrough in that. You have a move toward Western development. And even though in some cases it wasn't homesteading, it still was enough of a land distribution. The United States avoided the whole feudal land setup. As a matter of fact, Louis Hartz, a historian at Harvard, wrote a famous book in 1948, I think, called The Liberal Tradition. And basically what he said was the difference in the United States, the reason why the United States never had a Marxist party, was essentially liberal capitalist, is because we avoided the whole feudal land setup. And I think that's probably true, and it's a broad statement. In cases where we had a sort of a feudal land setup, interestingly enough, for example, when the United States conquered Mexico and grabbed the whole Southwest from Mexico, there were a lot of Spanish land grants, and in some cases, the Spanish land grants were usually seized by the U.S. government or California government, however it is, and you get huge land amassed, huge land acreage. But they usually, again, washed out. They didn't stay there because there was nobody there. They wanted settlement. They wanted to subdivide it and sell it. So eventually, it was, again, washed out. Fortunately, we didn't have this problem. There was one interesting thing is there were a lot of Spanish land grants which we decided to honor in Mexico and Texas, Mexico, I think. Texas and Mexico. And the United States grabbed it anyway, and they still have the deeds there. The whole New Mexican rebellion movement where the people have they have the deeds given to their ancestors. And here it is. And I own 100 acres. Most of it is owned by the American Park Service, so Forest Service. So that there's an obvious clash with the deeds are there and they're not being honored by the United States government. At any rate, but basically we have a land system which is more or less free and open. That's the resulting from this lack of a tight feudal land system. In Utah, also particularly, the Mormons settled Utah in a very homesteading fashion. So what you had in Utah developed was a small farms and homesteading kind of a situation. Okay. I will get into the water thing, I think, at some point. It's a whole interesting area. I'll just touch on it here. In Europe, of course, water is generally considered superabundant. There's no such thing as a water shortage in Holland or something like that. In fact, they plenty of water. They sort of use it to have more landfill. So the question is who owns water? Who owns what water? The way the common law developed in Europe is the so-called riparian system, P-A-R-I-A-N, where you have a river, say, you own, let's say you have a house or a land right on this river, you own this part of the river. You own this chunk of the river extending into it, just because you happen to live next to it. That's the so-called riparian scheme. Obviously, it's not a very good way of allocating river resources. I mean, it means you can lock up this whole river thing. Nobody worried about it. They didn't think about rivers being a scarce resource. Except when it comes to polluting, upstream, polluting downstream, whatever. Aside from that, there wasn't too much problem there. When you got in the same law then applied to the eastern United States, you still have a riparian water system, but water ownership. I mean, it means essentially you can't do much of anything. You have to have some way of getting around this. In the West, we always have a big water shortage, water scarcity. In the West, for example, it says river. You look at a map, it says river. There's nothing there, just a dry depression. And only a couple of months a year do you actually have water running through it. So, as a result of this very different kind of water system they hit out there, they invented the so-called appropriations. They have more or less a homesteading system in rivers. It worked pretty well. Unfortunately, what happened was, it's not pure private ownership. What happened is if you don't use your 3%, let's say you have the first 3%, or the second 3% or whatever, if you don't use it, the ownership reverts back to the state government, which can then hand it out in some other way. So as a result, you can't really sell your rights to it. It's not a full private property situation. There's an approach toward it, but it really doesn't meet the whole thing. As a result, it doesn't work too well, especially when you're trying to change uses. So, for example, in California, the constant wars, of course, there's water in the Colorado River, which goes through Nevada and down to Arizona or something, and who gets it? So, Los Angeles, of course, is built out of a desert. They need lots of water all the time, so shouldn't they get water? So Los Angeles is getting water from Northern California, from the Colorado River, and they're accused by the other guys of stealing their water. So constant political fights. They wouldn't have to do that let's say you own 3% down here, let's say, of the flow, you should be able to sell it to Los Angeles. Why not? You sell the rights to it, there'd be no problem. But you can't do it because it reverts back to the Arizona government of the Northern California government. So it becomes a political football instead of simply a market phenomenon. There were, of course, attempts now to try to make it a full appropriation system with full rights to buy and sell. That would eliminate most of the water crisis between different governments, different regions, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, right now, you have a series of fantastic multi-billion-dollar boondoggles. They just completed the Central Arizona project in Arizona, which takes water from the Colorado River and brings it to southern Arizona. It's cost of, umpteen $1 billion to the taxpayer for many years. What they do is they send the water in here, then the water is, of course, extremely scarce, right? Instead of charging a high price, the market price to the farmers, they charge a very low price. They subsidize very cheap water, way below the price that costs the taxpayer. And they make the farmers use all of it. If you don't use it or lose it. So you get this cheap water, except you have to use all of it. And when they encourage them to grow these crops, which they can't sell except at a very low price, as a result, the government then pays the farmers not to produce it. It's an unbelievable situation. They take wheat or something, or cotton, whatever they're growing there. They pay the farmers, they subsidize the farmers to buy the water at a very cheap rate. So it encourages fantastic waste of the water at a cheap rate. Then they grow the crops which they can't sell at a high enough price, so the government buys it back or pays them more money not to grow the crops. So they pay them twice, once to irrigate the crops, and two, not to grow them. Of course, the farmers love it. The farmers are getting paid 3 ways, or at least 2 ways. Paid to produce the stuff and then paid not to produce it. Double. And of course, the government, agriculture department loves it. They're getting all these dams, the interior department, they're getting lots of people, lots of employees, they're building their empire, they're getting lots of money from the taxpayer. The only people who don't love it are the poor consumers and taxpayers. They're paying for the nose for this. Paying for scarce water, to waste scarce water, and then paying not to grow the crops, which they're being subsidized to grow. Totally nutso system. But it's not so nutso from the point of view of the federal government and the point of view of the state governments are in on the take, and the farmers. Those 3 groups love it. All right. The people who are against it, or taxpayers don't know much. The free market economists are against it, and the environmentalists are against it. So you have a growing coalition in the West, the free market economists and environmentalists. Of course, say, Jesus, you're wasting this water, you're killing wildlife, or whatever it is. So you have an interesting new coalition of these groups here. Okay, I'll get back to water a little bit later on land, but continue on with the railroads. By the mid-1880s, we had every large town in the United States had at least 2 railroads, sometimes more than that. There were, for example, between St. Louis and Atlanta, there were 20 competing railroad routes. Lots of competition. Don't forget there were no roads. So, have to always understand that. And the railroad rates kept going down, as I said last time, all the time, constantly, especially in spurts. There'd be a big price war to go down, and it would stay fixed and then go down again. There were the 5 so-called trunk lines. The trunk lines are the big 5 railroads which went from the eastern seaboard to Chicago, basically. And you have several of these transcontinental roads going from Chicago or Omaha or something to the west. And you have the basic lines going from the eastern seaboard to Chicago. You had B&O, Baltimore and Ohio, which went from Baltimore to Chicago. And Pennsylvania Railroad, which went from Philadelphia. New York Central, which went from New York up the Hudson. And there was also the Erie Railroad, and there's also Grand Trunk, which went all the way up Canadian border, I think, to Boston. So, and they were very fiercely competitive. You realize they compete, of course, even though they don't go to the same places, but they compete. Philadelphia merchants are competing with New York merchants and so forth for the Chicago market. So, as we'll see, they were constantly trying to have cartels to try to stop this. One interesting thing is when they had a cartel, they were trying to figure out how to price this thing. Each railroad was arguing from its own self-interest, of course. What should pricing be based on? For example, Baltimore, Ohio, and Pennsylvania have the shortest routes, the shortest mileage. So they claim you should base rates on distance. Those of us who have shorter roads should charge a lower price. If you have a higher, longer road, you should charge a higher price. Obviously, they want to screw the competitors here. New York Central, which had a longer route, said, no, you should base pricing on the cost of operation. It turned out that New York Central had easier grades, so that it was less costly to build the actual track. And they had denser traffic, so they had lower operating costs. So they were arguing for that. Of course, there's no way to resolve this argument except on the free market. You just charge whatever you get away with, and the competitors can let you get away with. If you're trying to have a cartel, these become very important, trying to figure out, well, geez, what should we base the pricing on? Well, there's no rational way, quote unquote, to decide between this. And Grand Trunk, which is always on the edge of bankruptcy anyway, was the shakiest shape, and eventually did go bankrupt. They said you should only charge to cover operating costs. Shouldn't have to cover construction costs, as they could hardly cover anything. Anyway, there was a series of rate wars between these Grand Trunk lines in 1876, so that all rates fell. Which touched off by the completion of the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad in 1874, which starts the big series of rate wars. And so, for example, between 1876 and 77, just in that 1 year, give you an idea, first class freight rates from the east to Chicago, and there was several classes, a bunch of like 4 or 5 classes. So first class charged higher rates than the fourth class, let's say. Lower rates than fourth class. The first class freight rates, let's say, fell from 75 cents per hundredweight, CWT, hundredth weight, I guess per mile here. From 75 cents to a quarter. In other words, it fell by 2/3 and it stayed there. It's not as if it was short run temporary. Big smash. The eastbound rate was going from Chicago eastward, fell from $1 a hundredweight to 15 cents. So, and the passenger rates were cut in half. They didn't worry that much about passengers, because passengers are a very small portion of the income, but that was cut in half too. By the way, one way that the railroads curried favor of the government, this is all throughout. Railroads, of course, are the way to travel, and big shots of the government got free passes, railroad passes. If you're a senator or governor, whatever, you get an automatic pass, which finds you to be more friendly, benevolent, so the railroad gives you a pass. So you had this railroad system. I'll now give you a first class is the highest rate, and then it got lower from then on. To give you more a broader view here, freight rates. Take May 1865, and we're taking this whole period, and the end of 1888. We have the freight rates from New York to Chicago, westbound freight rates, New York to Chicago. And this is the standard freight rate for different classes. First class, second class, third, and fourth class. And this is $2.15, I guess per hundredth weight again. Went down to 75 cents. $1.80 went down to 65 cents. $1.06 down to 50 cents. 96 cents went down to 35. And this is a little bit overdrawn because prices went down during this period, so there was deflation. But even with that, even correcting for that, it still was a big drop. In other words, it's still a huge drop even in real freight rates, much less money freight rates. Another thing they did as part of the competitive process, not only did they cut the freight rates, they also cut the classification. One way of competing, you keep the freight rates the same, but you declassify products. In other words, one way of competing was you keep the rates the same. My rates are the same, but you move stuff from first class to second class, or from second to third. You lower the classification, you're really, of course, making it cheaper while the rates remain the same. It's like nowadays you quote, don't increase the income tax, but you have inflation, everybody's wafted into a higher tax bracket, and you pay a bigger proportion. So you increase the income tax without saying you have a tax increase. By the way, the latest nonsense is just yesterday. This is totally irrelevant to our course here. But it isn't, because it is modern American economic history. Reagan has always been saying he's not going to have any tax increase. Well, over the years, he's had a revenue enhancement. So it's the revenue enhancement, it's not a tax increase. He's had closing of the loopholes, doesn't call it a tax increase. And now he has something, he said, well, he's not going to increase taxes, he's just going to find new revenue sources. Now, you tell me what the difference is between a tax increase and finding a new revenue source. We're just tapping new revenue source. That's not increasing tax. You keep your pledge not to increase taxes by calling it by saying it's not a tax relief, just in rhetoric. You do it in reality, you don't do it in rhetoric, you think you've accomplished something. All right, that's, but in those days, things were getting cheaper all the time. And they're getting cheaper officially and also unofficially by having lower classifications of freight. In addition to that, railroads were so competitive, they would have special rates. In other words, you have as railroads, you have shippers. Everybody else was a shipper. If you were a railroad, you were shipping things. You were shipping freight. And and railroads were so anxious for shippers' business that they would have special rates or rebates from the official rate. Rebate meant a discount. If you get in my business, I'll give you a 10% cut off the list. See, in business, you don't want to cut the list. And if you cut the price of the list, it's a real commitment. It's a big open commitment. It means you have a list price, you're cutting whatever it is, Coca-Cola or whatever it is. You don't you hate to cut the price. You hope that maybe it'll go up again soon. So what you do is you have special discounts for customers, different kinds of customers, new customers, old customers, whatever. And when the big, as we'll see later, when the big charge came that Standard Oil was having special rebates, it was one of the big, quote, monopoly things about Standard Oil. Special rebates from railroads for shipping and stuff. It's true they had special rebates, but everybody else had special rebates. All the other oil companies had rebates. Everybody had rebates. The whole world had rebates. The whole world lived off, in other words, not only did the official rates go down, not only were classifications going down, but every shipper was getting a rebate. Some were getting more than others, some less than others. Every shipper was getting discounts. There was a famous story, Professor Stiegler, who later got a Nobel Prize in economics, did a famous study of the steel rail taper. For many years, economists claimed there was something very peculiar about steel rail prices. Say from 1900 to 1940 or whatever it is, for 40 years, steel rails remained fixed. And this is the price of steel rails. They continued, they always were fixed, whether they have a boom or a depression or whatever, the price of steel rails were fixed. Many theories were invented to try to explain this. Why should prices be? It doesn't make any sense. We know the prices go up, the demand increases, we know they go down when supply increases. Why do prices remain fixed? All sorts of crazy theories were concocted to figure this out. Well, Stiegler pointed out, and has been pointed out for other things, before you try to explain a phenomenon, you have to really make sure the phenomenon exists. Right? Before you invent a theory to explain something, you have to be sure the thing actually exists. How do they know that steel rails are fixed in price? Because the list price remains the same. If you're an economist, economic historian, you're lazy, you look at the list price and say, well, that's it. If you go out on the real world, however, almost none of these things were sold at list prices. The important thing is what was the real price for real transactions. So somebody I think it was Stiegler went out and made a study of what actually the prices were over the years. It turned out nobody sold at list. If you had a boom period, it sold like 5% down from list, and a depression, it sold 30% down. So steel rail prices were fluctuating all the time. It just that they weren't recorded in the books. I mean, in the official price list books. So what you're trying to find out is what the actual price is. And as I say, discount off list is a time-honored method of sale in business. Especially in the business is uncertain what's going to happen, and you figure, well, you'll give a discount. So, and remember that in a cartel, the thing which breaks a cartel, as I mentioned last time, is secret price cutting, secret rebates. You're giving secret rebates when you don't want your fellow cartelists to find out you're screwing them here. You're giving a secret, you're breaking your agreement by giving a special rebate off list. But these things are not even secret. They were done all the time. In addition to competing by cutting rates, you have to realize the whole emphasis in these days, of course, the whole emphasis is how do you have a hidden price increase? In those days, the emphasis was have a hidden price fall. Prices were falling all the time because there was tremendous competition, a tremendous increase in production. It was a wonderful time for the consumer to be alive. So in addition to prices being cut, quality of service kept going up. They kept giving him extra deals. One thing which the railroads began to do is, for example, give you special discounts if you fill up the railroad car. There's obviously why. You have a railroad car. There's obvious reasons for that. They try not to send the car out until it's fully loaded. And so if you can have a shipment which fills up the whole car, you're in great shape. If, on the other hand, you only have a third of the car, you have to wait till somebody else has stuff for the other two-thirds. And so they started charging lower rates if you can fill the car up. There's nothing sinister about that. And that's one reason why if you have a high-quantity shipper, you can get a lower rate because you can fill the car up and get it out there. I mean, no railroad wants to have a car sitting around a lot. So that's another thing. Discounts were given for that. So obviously, when Standard Oil, we'll go get to Standard Oil later on, but when Standard Oil starts filling up lots of cars with oil, they're obviously going to get a lower rate because they can guarantee a fully loaded car, railroad car. So, for example, New York Central at one point had 6,000 rebates. 6,000 rebates to shippers. And it was called special contracts or special rates. Sometimes the railroads start paying for storage. And it's another thing. Who pays for storage? The shipper pays, the railroad pays. Well, it's up to, it's a contractual situation. As the railroads were battling for business, they started taking over the storage fees. So one way, of course, for having hidden increases, if you have government, say, regulation of rates, and you want to have an increase and they don't allow you an increase, is reclassifying class rates upward. You keep the same rate, that's later on, like the 20th century. Then you have, well, we have the same, we haven't raised our fares in 30 years, except for what used to be third class is now first class, buddy. Okay, that's one way of doing it, without doing it officially, without raising officially. But the 19th century is the other way around, it was cutting rates. Okay, so what you had then is the first big business was a highly competitive industry, and another thing I should say is that I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the South was always bellyaching about this. Why were freight rates in Southern railroads higher than Northern railroads? Always complaining about this. Felt there was something sinister, some plot against the South. It wasn't any plot at all. It was economically very easy to understand. First place, they had no through lines in the South. In other words, the railroad lines in the North were long through lines, either from the east to Chicago or on west, transcontinental lines. The South had short railroads. They didn't have any real trunk lines. And actually, it was short railroad. They couldn't have big discounts. They had short routes. They had high fixed costs, terminal costs, and therefore they're going to have higher costs. They're going to have undoubtedly going to have higher rates. Another thing about the South was they had a triangular pattern. They developed trade. They would buy food, let's say, or grain from the Midwest. They'd sell cotton to the East. Okay. As a result, the cars would be empty and going both ways here. The South would have nothing much to sell to the West. Railroad cars would be empty, and they wouldn't have much this way. So in other words, they were half full. And so they couldn't get the quantity discounts. They'd be paying higher rates because the cars were half empty on the other route, empty on the way back. And it's unfortunate, but that's the way it was. It was not a plot. Good economic reasons for this. It wasn't, quote, discrimination, unquote. At any rate, in response, so we have then a very competitive railroad system, very productive, very competitive, even overbuilt in some cases. We have a tremendous drop in freight rates throughout. As a result of this, from the very beginning, starting in the late 1860s, railroads were desperately attempting to have a cartel, trying to get a cartel, trying to raise their rates. And since they were the first big business, they were the first cartelists. And there's a great book on this by Cooke, who wrote our book on Triumph of Conservatism. You're interested in this area. It's called Railroads and Regulations. I don't think it might be in paperback even. Anyway, I recommend it for those of you who are interested in going into this. And he talks about this in detail. The railroads are desperately trying to form a cartel, headed by J.P. Morgan, who now becomes, after the early 70s, the top, and even before that was important, the top railroad investment banker. And trying to form a cartel, cutting shipments, getting quotas, and raising the rate. They try to do it. Every one was a flopperoo. Every one of them flopperoo very quickly. I'll mention there's a couple of them, a couple of leading flopperoos here. They couldn't do it. They had internal price cutting and external new sources of new railroads coming in. Very simply, they try to have, you set a freight rate between here and here. You have 2 or 3 railroads, and they fix the price and cut the shipment. A new railroad will come in and undercut them. That'll be the end of it. They have better equipment to be newer. So these two things broke every railroad cartel. By the way, in railroads, cartels are called pools. Railroad pools, for some reason. Pooling their resources. In one case, kind of charming. In some cases, one guy would own, let's say there are two railroads here. I think one case we'll get to is what happened. One guy would own both railroads. The managers are different. The sales vice president of each railroad, they didn't want to keep if you're a sales manager, your whole life is based on how much you can sell. They disobey the orders of the owner. They started undercutting the cartel in order to pick up more for their railroad, more business for their railroad. Charming. Here they are. Here one guy owns these two railroads. He orders them to keep the price up and cut the shipment. And they both violate it anyway. They both go ahead and they start giving discounts and pick up shipment. Each sales manager is his own thing, That's his ego. His life is wrapped up in that. And he violated it anyway. So you had competition. Even one guy owned both railroads. One charming case of this is, in one case, one of the most important cartels was called the Iowa Pool. There's a very good book on this by Julius Grodzinski called The Iowa Pool. One of our top, I guess is dead now, and one of the top railroad historians. And the conditions for a cartel were great. I mean, if you're interested in having a cartel, couldn't have been better than these conditions. Because what you had was really three railroads competing for the top Illinois, Iowa business here. So if you have, and two of them I think were owned by the one guy. Okay, I'll get to them. Okay, and so this is Illinois here. This is Iowa. The important thing is to try to get to the eastern terminus of Union Pacific, namely Omaha. Omaha's up here. Okay, Omaha's a twin city with Council Bluffs, which is on the Iowa side of this thing. I think the terminus is in Council Bluffs. Okay. So the thing is, what the Iowa Pool dealt with was the Chicago-Omaha market, which becomes extremely important. I mean, he has a transcontinental railroad going west. You want to hook up with all the eastern stuff coming in Chicago. So this is a key in Chicago around here. So the point is, how do you get from Chicago to Council Bluffs? One way is there were basically three railroad routes. And one was this one. I guess this is sort of the shortest, coming like that. This is the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. The other one is sort of like this, coming up like that. This is the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. This is the famous Rock Island line. It's a great folk song about. You have the Rock Island line, you have the Chicago Northwestern, and another one called the Burlington. Another one went like this. So down like that. Burlington, Missouri, which and Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. These two roads, this went up like this. Okay, so you had three alternative routes. This one which hooks up here, and these two. So they figured if you have a cartel of these three routes, you can be in great shape. You can not only raise the rates, you also raise the rates of the Union Pacific. So you can screw Union Pacific in that sense. And here's Union Pacific with a transcontinental railroad. You make them pay to transfer to the Chicago route. If you raise the rate and cut the shipment. That was the idea behind the Iowa Pool. Now Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and the Burlington and Missouri, these two lines here, this thing here was owned by our pal James Joy, the railroad king. Remember the guy who got the Cherokee lands from his brother-in-law, Secretary of the Interior. And he was the owner of these two railroads here, this joint known as the Burlington system. Burlington system. And he was essentially invested in by the Boston capitalists, Boston group, the Forbes group. And he also controlled a couple of other railroads in this area. And this is the Burlington system. The Rock Island line was owned by John Tracy. Who also owned the Chicago Northwestern. There was one guy, John Tracy, essentially controlled or owned these top two. Here's here, Chicago Northwestern, Rock Island, and Jim Joy owned the Burlington system. So there's two people. They could just work out a cartel. You could think it'd be easy as pie. And that's what they did. They formed the pool, and let's see, I think in 1870, I believe. And it lasted officially for about 15 years. Actually, it collapsed in not too many years, in a few years, by the late 70s. And they say you'd think it'd be duck soup to do this. And if there was cheating between these two, as I say, one of these, the sales vice president, sales managers would cut it anyway, even though John Tracy owned both of these roads, because there were all sorts of problems in that. They could never get, there was cheating between the two, there was secret price cutting and all the rest of it. And of course they kept asking for higher rates from the Union Pacific to permit the stuff to go on in Chicago or come in from Chicago. So finally what happened, to cut the thing short, because we have to leave in a minute, is that it's kind of interesting. What essentially happened was that Union Pacific got together and decided to crush the cartelists here by creating their own new railroad system, by getting together a whole bunch of little railroads and a whole Altoona system, Alton system, coming from St. Louis, so like here, coming from about here, before you get to Omaha, and down around here and up from St. Louis and up to Chicago. And by forming this thing, either by creating a new railroad or buying old ones and merging it, the Union Pacific undercut the whole cartel. And this was exactly what they did, and they broke the whole thing. And it took them about 7 or 8 years to do it. So in addition to the internal cheating with these three companies, two of which were owned by the same guy, eventually what Union Pacific simply got together a fourth system, created a fourth new system which got to butt the other three. That was the end of it. It was the end of the Chicago pool. It's kind of heroic. That's the market in action. And the free market is in action. Even if you have a couple of roads, which seems to be in great shape to have a cartel, you can't really continue it for very long. Okay.